if moral philosophy is apt to be boring at the present time, that is, I'm afraid, mostly because it's often badly done. It may be, however, that there is another important cause, namely, the respect with which philosophers treat the institution of morality. By this, I mean that our practice of judging things morally is treated as if it were not and could not be in question. It's quite indicative, for instance, of this attitude that analytic philosophers do not seem to think that the attacks on morality made by Nietzsche even need to be answered. Perhaps they feel that the most that could be put in question would be not the practice of making moral judgments, but some one code of morals. And with the content of moral judgments, they do not see themselves as philosophers as concerned. I think myself that this confidence in the invulnerability of morality is quite misplaced, and that there are a number of different ways in which it itself could be attacked, I mean the institution of morality. As, for instance, by arguing that the practice of making moral judgments does not contribute to human good, thus attacking morality from within and judging it, I believe, by its own internal ends. I mention this possibility, but with this particular argument, I'm not at the moment concerned. My starting point is rather the vague sense that many people have of the oddity of the business of making moral judgments and of its historical connection with religion and with primitive taboo. What I should like to do, what I have been doing in preparing this paper, is to stop blocking these thoughts, but rather to express them, crudely if necessary. I just once or twice heard Wittgenstein speak, and the thing I chiefly remember is he saying when somebody was wrapping up something that didn't sound too good about the self, to make it sound better, as we all do, Wittgenstein stopped him and said, "No, be crude. Say what you want to say, and then we shall get on." Now, I think of the moral skeptic, the particular one I'm concerned with, as saying something like this: making moral judgments is just a matter of expressing the prejudices of your society, or some other prejudices somehow acquired. For look, they may continue, at the extraordinary things that people have thought were immoral. How comic they seem to us, and how obvious it is that these moral views can be explained only by their origins in religious ordinances and social taboos. Why then should we think of our own moral judgments as anything more than the expression of the prejudices that we have been taught? This thought I should like to take seriously, and I shall begin by trying to show, perhaps it seemed to you a rather roundabout way, how very odd and problematic the whole business of making moral judgments really is. There is, I want to say, a real problem about the status of moral judgments. In order to try to bring this out, I shall leave morality quite aside for a while and talk about other examples of what we may very loosely call action-guiding expressions. These we find to be of two main types. On the one hand, we have those that we might call fiat-dependent. For instance, it is permitted, forbidden. by man or God. It is legal, illegal. It is done, not done. It is according to, not according to, the rules. In each case, I'm thinking not of the sentence in which the order, rule, and so on is promulgated, but of one depending on a prior promulgation, or on some tacit understanding about what is and is not to be done. Perhaps it will seem wrong to speak of fiat in the last case, for instance in relation to social norms, and we could as well label this class of expressions norm-dependent rather than fiat-dependent. It must, however, be remembered that we are talking about the things that are to be done. They are in some sense required, and not just about social customs. Even the most rule-bound societies, like England, have some customs that they do not impose or try to impose on their members. People in England do eat marmalade rather than jam for breakfast, and the practice is probably more universally followed than, e.g., that of waiting for women to go first through doors. It's not, however, required. One might say of eating marmalade for breakfast, it's a custom, but not a norm. Or again, one might say, there is no element of fiat here, that is, a will that the thing should be done. Two features of these sentences picked out as thus norm or fiat dependent are interesting from our point of view. The first is that they, unlike the promulgations, explicit or tacit, on which they depend, are open to confirmation or denial on the ground that the norm or fiat does not exist. If God or man has not forbidden certain conduct, it is false to say it is forbidden. If certain social behavior is not required, demanded, looked for in a certain society, it is false to say it's what's done, as opposed to what's not done. I hope you can hear an English tone of voice here. The second point of interest is that no other justification is necessary unless the question shifts, e.g., to the utility of a certain rule. If all one says is that it is forbidden, it's not done, it's taboo, one need only appeal to the existence of the fiat or norm. If someone asks, why is it forbidden, one may say, I don't know, or it just is. And this is true whether or not one is oneself prepared to avoid what is forbidden or not done, or whether one wishes others to do the same. So much for the moment about the first class of expressions, the ones we called norm or fiat dependent. I shall now turn to what I'd like to call evaluations, because this is much the most natural word to use. But I should say right at the start that as I use evaluation, there is no contrast to be drawn between an evaluation and a statement of fact. By evaluation, I mean just what would naturally in outside philosophy be called such. Or at any rate, the main range of the extension coincides with that of the term in everyday use. So that I say it's an evaluation when someone says that a certain thing is or will be useful, either in the general context presupposed by the occasion of utterance, or for some special purpose, either stated or understood. It is also an evaluation when we say that the food or wine at a certain restaurant is good, that a certain novel is a good novel, or when we pronounce on the merits of a doctor. If the extension of the term evaluation, as I use it, is somewhat wider than in everyday usage, this is because it will be pointless for my purposes to separate out the evaluation of doctors from the evaluation of, for instance, entertainers or parties. And it would not perhaps be quite according to everyday usage to talk of evaluating a party when one said perhaps it was quite a good party, which may be because parties are not strictly of value. Nevertheless, there is something that is, as Plato might say, the good rendered by the art of party giving, i.e. pleasure to the participants. And to say that a party is a good party is to say how this party stands in that respect. I shall therefore speak of evaluating the party, and of the sentence, "It was a good party," as one which is evaluative. But this talk about evaluation is an unimportant bit of terminology, which I would far rather leave behind if it confuses people by suggesting that I believe in a gap between evaluation and description, or evaluation and fact. The important thing is that I want to consider together a wide range of expressions to which both "he is a good doctor" and "that was a good party" belong. They are distinguished, I believe, by the possession of two characteristics, besides that of containing words such as good. 1. For each kind of thing, an F or a G, I think of this just as a schema for which one will fill in various things. For each kind of thing, an F or a G, judged a good F or G, there is at least one answer to the question, what's good about a good F, good G? So what's good about a good doctor is that he cures diseases. What's good about a good joke is that it's funny. What's good about good wine is that it tastes good. What's good about a good novel is that it's enthralling, or interesting, or moving, or reveals the human heart. In each case, the good F or G gives someone, not necessarily the speaker, something that is some use to him, or which is in some more direct way what he wants. I don't think one can give a proper account of all this until one can see much more clearly than we do now, or certainly than I do now, and I think perhaps than anyone does, as far as I know, the relation between, e.g., finding something interesting and wanting it, or again, between wanting it and finding it pleasant, or exciting, or amusing. So perhaps one should just say that for this condition, this first condition to be satisfied, there must be an answer to the question, what's good about the F's or G's called good F's or G's? And note that this question can be answered by talking about the interest, pleasantness, usefulness, and so on, of the things concerned. I've been talking about F's or G's in examples where one would naturally substitute, say, book, party, or doctor, but an entirely parallel account would go for the case of activities. If a certain way of driving is good driving, of singing, good singing, and so on, this depends on the fact that someone or other has some kind of interest in its being done that way. There is something good about good driving, safety to the driver and others, about good singing, pleasure and interest to the listener, and so on for good cooking, good nursing, and the rest. Then, 2, this is a second condition that I believe to hold for this class of expressions that I've picked out as evaluative. In no case is the actual goodness of a member of the class of F's or G's guaranteed by the fact that the one who says, this is a good F, this is a good G, is speaking correctly and sincerely in using the words. With this condition, I'm intending to pick out a range of expressions which I shall call objective, contrasting them with subjective expressions such as that feels good, that tastes good, when used, as these forms of words usually are, simply as an expression of the speaker's reactions or tastes. I think, for instance, one is too warm, somebody's opened a window, a nice cool breeze comes in, and one says, oh, that feels good. This is an example of a subjective expression. If I'm speaking sincerely and linguistically correctly, then there is no question about the truth of what I say. I mean, no challenge. I should explain further that when I say the actual goodness of the F or G is not guaranteed by the speaker's linguistic correctitude and sincerity, I mean to imply that the statements I am calling objective can be assailed by someone else or by the speaker himself at a different time. And I do not count as assailing a mere supposed confrontation by another speaker saying the form of words not P, where the speaker said P. And say, he is not a good doctor. It's not the case that he's a good doctor, where the speaker said he is a good doctor. Thus, I would not count it is a good F, for some substitution on F, as an objective statement, just because when A had said this, B could say the opposite. It's not the case that it's a good F, without imputing linguistic impropriety or insincerity to A. Nor would I be impressed, here I hope you can hear echoes of what I'm fighting in emotivism, for instance, nor would I be impressed by the suggestion that he really is opposing A, because, e.g., he is trying to persuade A not to call that doctor, a Stevensonian opposition of desires. I call the statement, he is a good doctor, assailable, because there is something B can do to show, in this case of the good doctor, possibly even prove that A is mistaken. There is some method which it is not open to A to reject as a method, so long as he uses the expression, so long as he uses the expression in the given context. He must therefore answer B's challenge or back down. He's not able to go on saying, it just is so, it just is a good such and such, whatever the reactions of others or the evidence they might bring against him. Now, are these two criteria that I've given, of which that one I've just gone through was the second, fulfilled for all the examples of evaluations that have been given so far in this paper? Perhaps there will not be much objection to an affirmative answer in the case of condition 1. There is some good in having a good doctor, listening to a good singer, reading a good novel, going to a good party, and so on. There's likely to be much more controversy about condition 2, which we might label the objectivity condition. And the following objections must be considered. A, that different people may want different things from F's or G's, some substitution, and so judge the merits differently. The answer to this is while there may be alternative established criteria giving what should properly be regarded as different and non-rival judgments, an individual cannot call something good, a good such and such, as opposed to, e.g., good for his purposes, without any reference to an established criterion. Thus, for instance, we might take as ambiguous the following sentence: unfortunately, they do not have very good food. In one context, as e.g. explaining why a certain hotel was not a success, The good of good food would be pleasure rather than nourishment. But the same sentence, used, say, by an anthropologist of a threatened tribe, would rather imply reference to health. What is quite clear in this case is that there is no room for ultimate disagreement, as if the two speakers should glare at each other and say to the other, "You're wrong." Nor can someone who wants something idiosyncratic from food, say a Borgia catering for an unloved guest, declare a certain dish good food on account of its connection with his own special aims. That was the first objection to the thesis that condition 2, the objectivity condition, is met for all the examples so far called evaluative. The second is as follows. Even if there is a characteristic good, which is the good of, say, good wine or good novels, and by which their merits have to be judged, surely I cannot maintain that this gives a method for proving who is right and who is wrong in cases where men disagree about the merits of a wine or a novel. Perhaps it is possible actually to prove that someone is a good doctor, sometimes at any rate. But surely, the objection goes, this cannot be true of a good wine or a good novel. This I would entirely accept. The way in which the expression good wine is used is very different from that of good doctor, and different again from good novel. We bring evidence that a man is a good doctor, and evidence is the right word here, by citing the cures he has made. And a basis for agreement is given by the fact that this is definitionally relevant, I mean the cures he has made and the methods he uses, and that some things do and some do not count as cures. Wine, on the other hand, is simply tasted. Nevertheless, there is a whole lot of structure behind the use of the expression good wine as we actually have it. In the first place, there are connoisseurs of wine, and their judgment has a decisive force that ours does not. Speaking for myself, I know very little about wine. But how and why is this so? Let us first look at the characteristic of the connoisseur. Is a connoisseur simply one who is experienced in the matter of tasting wine? Any wine bibber of eclectic tastes is that. Is it rather that the one who counts as a connoisseur is the man who is able to make fine distinctions between tastes, particularly wines, like Hume's man who detected the leather thong? This is the characteristic of the connoisseur, but does not explain why it is that he is made the judge of good and bad. But suppose we take as a parallel case the case of men trained in the fine discrimination of shades of colours and their names, as I believe that for some commercial purposes, perhaps in America things are worked differently, some men are. Why would it be strange to count as good colours the ones that these colour discriminators liked? Simply, I think, because the facts of the case are different here. In the first place, there is, as far as I know, no common reaction belonging to those either trained or naturally gifted in the discrimination of colours and paying it particular attention, so that they agree in what they like. There is, it's reasonable to assume, nothing equivalent to the agreement in appreciation between connoisseurs of wine, to which, moreover, other people can, by habituation and attention, often be brought. So it would be extremely odd and quite pointless to call the colours which, say, the majority of colour discriminators liked good colours, as if red might be said to be a better colour than green. Some such use could be set up but we don't have it, and it would be a pointless affair. The facts about our use of the expression good wine seem then to be like this. When a man says that a wine is good wine, he does not just mean, in fact, he does not mean that it tastes good to him. It would not be right to say that of the ordinary man, and it's not true even of the wine connoisseur, who, when he says the wine is good, assumes the common reaction of appreciation among himself and other connoisseurs. If it fails, there is practically nothing, I believe, that can be said. I take it that it's all pretty well nonsense, the talk of wine connoisseurs. I may apologize to them if I'm wrong. And one would not speak of a wine connoisseur showing why he said what he did. Nevertheless, the non-connoisseur who likes, say, British port-type wine, you have to taste this to understand what I really mean, it would simply be called wrong if he said it was good wine. And the connoisseur, if he found himself surprisingly out on a limb, expecting but not getting any appreciation of something he liked, must finally say, "How odd, I like it," rather than "it is good." The facts about our shared reaction to novels, pictures and so on, to aesthetic objects, are in some ways the same and in some ways different from this. They're the same, A, insofar as there are recognized connoisseurs of art objects. B, insofar as there is a certain community of taste, particularly between people of a given culture at a given time. And C, insofar as the concept of proof has no application here. On the other hand, on this last point, there is a certain shared reaction to what is said about pictures or novels, or to the pointing out of features in them previously missed. I'm thinking of something quite simple, like someone pointing out the reflection of shapes throughout a picture, a repetition of forms, or perhaps the delineation of a character, subtle delineation of a character. For this reason, it is here right to speak of one man showing another that an art object had certain merit, as long as this perhaps superlative merit, as long as this showing is not thought of as the kind of demonstration that is equivalent to proof. This adds an extra dimension to the matter of personal dissent, since one who found himself making an appreciation that others found strange might have the idea that he had not yet hit on a way of making them see what he saw in the thing, which would of course require more than that they hadn't seen and that the number of things to say was infinite. There is such a thing as being aware that one has something to show which other people haven't yet seen. But of course this case is not given simply by liking what other people do not. In the latter case, where there is merely idiosyncratic liking or interest, a man would say, not "in my opinion it is good," he must rather move over to the subjective form of speech. I'm thinking, for instance, as a slightly far-out example, if you like, to show what I mean. I believe that Wittgenstein liked to go to very bad films. I'm told that he would go to these films, sit right close up to the screen, and of course he thought they were bad films, like everybody else. But it's what he wanted. And I myself am like this. In American motels, I like to turn on some appalling late night show, and the worse it is, the more people are shooting each other up and so on, the quicker I go off to sleep. and for my purposes, it's absolutely excellent. But of course, and that's just what I like to have on, very, very loud. Somehow these people shooting takes care of the world, and I drop off to sleep. But of course, it would be absolutely ludicrous for me to say, I think that this is a good show. Not at all. It's a good one for my purposes. And if one wants yet another example, think of the case perhaps of a book a novel that is perhaps by someone one knows, or about people who seem like oneself, and one has absolutely glued to this novel, but one doesn't therefore think one can say it's a good novel. Well, these are just two. I've thrown in some more, I think, but the script says these are just two. Out of all the examples that might have been chosen to show, I think really, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be clowning. It is the two really were the wine and the art and the aesthetic objects, and there still are two. These are just two. Out of all the examples that might have been shown to show the different ways in which the expression good F, good G may be used. The background assumption of shared reaction and the way in which this may or may not be obtained. Whether, e.g., there is a common reaction universally among a certain group, after a certain training or habituation, after certain things have been said, whether it is or isn't right to speak of criteria or of proof. Now, it may be objected that I have no right to use the word objective, as I do, and that there is no objective use of good in connection with either novels or pictures or wine or food, since here there are no facts, but only subjective reactions. This, I suggest, is a prejudice, which may come from a mistaken picture of what a fact can be. Presumably no one will deny it to be a fact that something is, for instance, red or not red. Yet is not Wittgenstein right in insisting, this is in the investigations, that the final basis for the objectivity of this judgment is a shared reaction to new examples after a certain training? We do, more or less, all go on the same way in grouping things as red, as we agree in saying 102, 104, rather than 104, 108, when we've been asked to go on adding 2 to some number below 100. This is roughly Wittgenstein, of course. People will no doubt recognize Wittgenstein's example. If there was not quite a lot of agreement, there couldn't be here any matter of fact or getting it right. On the other hand, it would surely hardly matter if this agreement didn't extend to members of every group. Perhaps it is impossibly unnatural to people of some races, or to Martians, to group colors as we do. So they would say of 2 shades that we count as both red, they're not the same at all. Perhaps it would be impossible even to train them to react as we do. Would this mean that it would no longer be a fact that poppies are and delphiniums are not red? Would our use of red, which would be just as before, now not count as objective? Perhaps it will be said that in the case of colors, we would still have objectivity, since, though the basis of the objectivity is a de facto and perhaps limited agreement in reaction, this reaction to colors, is not a matter of attitude, as it is when we're talking about making evaluations. Well, strictly, the reaction of the man who likes a given wine or food is not a matter of attitude either, but let that pass. It's a reaction of liking or appreciation. And one can, of course, make a distinction between such reactions, which are in a special way connected with reasons for acting, and reactions such as saying of something, "It is red." The question is why we should connect this difference with a lack of objectivity. Are we to say that wherever we have an evaluation, and then therefore I think some analytic connection with reasons for action for someone, there is no objectivity and there are no facts, so that it isn't a fact that a thing is or isn't useful, or that so-and-so is or isn't a good doctor? Probably this would seem to anyone to be going a bit far. And the reply may be that these, the ones I just quoted, are facts all right, because evidence can be brought and the matter proved. But why set so much stock on this one way of operating with an expression? Of course one does not bring evidence that wine is good wine. Agreement is secured when it is in other ways. And so it is with good novels or pictures, though here, as I said, there is something more like evidence because of the things that may be said to show. One may, if one cares, so define objectivity or fact, a very artificial definition, I think, as to rule out the cases, A, where agreement is not secured or even expected across cultures. So it's only one couldn't say that it was a fact, say that food was good in a certain restaurant. Or B, where the method of securing agreement is not that of proof. But there is still a world of difference between a subjective statement, such as, "I like this wine," which requires no shared reaction in the sense of common reaction to given examples as its basis. Compare, "I like blue best of all the colors," and the judgments about what is good. Perhaps those who deny objectivity to the latter are thinking, and perhaps this is their most fundamental thought, that there isn't really all that much difference between saying "this is a good wine" and "I like this wine," because someone who found his reaction differing from that of others might express a thought which had nothing to do with common agreement or with the special position accorded to the appreciation of the connoisseurs. I mean that in saying "this is a good wine," he expresses a thought which has none of these usual connections. But why should it be assumed that this is possible? The thoughts that can be expressed, and of course had, depend on the actual usages established in the language. Why should a man who uses the words, and these are the sounds that come from his mouth, "it is a good wine," "it is a good picture," be saying anything at all where the usual conditions of the use of the expression had been put aside? As for his expressing the same thought as is usually expressed, this is ridiculous. What he says could at best be equated with some subjective expression such as "I like it." And this runs into the difficulty involved in the thought that one might say "it is raining" and mean "I am tall," since "it is a good F" does not, in the examples we have been considering, have the meaning "I like this F." To go back to the main division of action-guiding language with which we were operating, we've been discussing two kinds of expressions. One, those which are fiat or norm dependent, like "it is permitted," "it is illegal," "it's not done," "it is taboo." And two, "he is a good doctor," "it's a good picture," "the food," "the wine is good." With neither of these is there, it seems to me, any special problem about the status of the assertion. One, the first, depends on the existence of fiats or norms. The other, on the connection that certain things and activities have with some good rendered, and on the construction of objective uses of expressions of the good F form made possible by common interests, as in doctoring, and shared reactions, such as of pleasure in certain wines and certain food, and pleasure and interest in particular aesthetic objects. Let us now return to what I earlier set aside, namely moral judgments, expressed typically in such sentences as, "He is a good man," or "that action was morally bad." At least philosophers always say that's how they express. I don't know that they really are, but let that pass. What can their status be? Obviously, they are not fiat or norm dependent in the sense described, since it is neither necessary nor possible to justify them by referring to what is ordered, encouraged, or required. This is so, of course, whether or not one accepts, say, Christianity, because morality is, of course, supposed to stand on its own. I mean, to be able to stand on its own. Do they, the moral judgments, then belong to the second class of judgments, asserting objective value and depending on the conditions suggested for such assertions? Now, this does not seem to be an implausible suggestion, given the, first of all, the obvious utility, or let's say, to take account of Nietzschean attacks, the apparent obvious utility of a moral system, supposed obvious utility of a moral system as a social arrangement, and the connections that can be traced between, say, the cardinal virtues and human good and harm. One need not, of course, it is very important for me to make this disclaimer, suppose that there is some simple connection between rightness and wrongness, or good and bad action, and the good or harm of human beings, nor bring a preconception about the methods by which disagreements can be resolved, or the extent to which resolution will be possible. I think it's a piece of work that I want to go on and do, but couldn't do in time to present it today. I think the question of the resolution or non-resolution across cultures is something really extremely interesting that hasn't even now been dealt with quite from the point of view of analytic philosophy, which must, I think, make comparisons with other expressions which have what we might call an indexical element in them. A very simple example even is, say, "I am tall." In England, I give this an example as of a just obviously true statement. It struck me as I stood with people towering above me, getting some tickets once, that of course people wouldn't take it like that in America at all, because everyone's much taller. All that I'm suggesting, all that is suggested in this view, which would put moral judgments among objective judgments of value, with the good doctors, good wine, good novels, and we're not saying at all which it's most like or whether it's different. All that is suggested is that it makes sense to say that such and such a thing is good or bad from the moral point of view, and to see this expression as operating objectively. Incidentally, whether or not this view is to be represented as naturalistic depends on the definition of that term. I don't know, was the sketch that I gave of the goodness of good wine or of a good picture or novel a naturalistic account or not? I'm perfectly happy to say it was, but most people reject such an account of moral values as objective, or rather, even if they want to use the word objective, they insist that my condition is not met. So, in substance, they're disagreeing with me. There are several reasons for this. One, the idea they have of objectivity, taken, for instance, from natural science, or very limited areas even there, does not, in several respects, fit the actual use of moral terms. Well, it doesn't fit our other examples either, or even good doctor, perhaps. Two, they want to insist on the absolute right of some individual to assert the rightness or wrongness of some line of conduct that nobody else thinks right or wrong without the need of any defense. This, I think, is crucial. Now let us look at this second supposed fact about moral judgment. The observation that in the case of moral judgment, it is possible for an individual to say, quite idiosyncratically, it just is wrong, has been of huge importance in shaping the account of moral judgment given by moral philosophers. G.E. Moore's open question argument against naturalism depended on just this. And most of the developments in ethics during the first half of the century have consisted in a defense of Moore's suggestion and an attempt to find a moral theory that would take it into account. Now one might ask, where does such an idea come from? I mean, that an individual can say of anything at all, it just is wrong. I mean, anything at all within the realm of the doable. Since we don't actually come across individuals who start saying, as in an example that I once discussed with Hare in private conversation, saying that it's morally wrong to run round trees right-handed. I forget whether I've published this, but anyway, he says indeed they could. Or something equally odd and equally indefensible by the criteria we usually use for showing that there is a moral objection to some kind of conduct. The answer is, and this is all to where the idea comes from, the answer is, I think, that we do find people saying it is wrong to do X, where no justification of the ordinary kind could be given, and that they do fall back on the statement that it just is wrong. I'm thinking particularly of the things that quite a number of people are, or have been, of course, many people still are, ready to say, particularly in the field of sexual morality. As, for instance, there are moral objections to polygamy. I mean, not it's a bad social custom and the wives suffer, but just it is wrong. For all I know, there are moral objections to polygamy, but the case should be, I think, argued. That sounds as if the wives are rather happy, as far as I've read. One also finds, for instance, people saying homosexuality is morally objectionable, homosexual practices are morally objectionable, or masturbation is wrong, and other very peculiar judgments about what parts of the body may or may not touch and be touched in sexual contact, even within marriage. I suppose there is no doubt that some of these, as I think, curious ideas can be traced back to religious prohibitions or to social taboos. And yet, though sometimes, of course, people do give defenses of them, and then one must engage with them. If they say such and such is degrading, one will start to talk to them, and I think they will lose the argument. But yet, would want to say, speaking about the majority who do not, as I would abusively say, cook up some defense, yet they are not now asserted as such, I mean as religious prohibitions or social taboos, or not by a lot of the people who would go in for them. I mean the taboos. Since someone who thinks that polygamy or masturbation or homosexual practices or some such thing is wrong, thinks it neither necessary nor possible, very often, to back up what he says by referring to God's commandments or to a social taboo. Usually, in my experience, he simply asserts what he says, and other people suppose that he has the right to do so, even if they themselves would not want to take advantage of that right. It is this, I think, examples of this kind, not defended in this way, but with simply assertion, is wrong. It is this, I think, that makes moral judgment so problematic. And one sees exactly why people should sometimes be moral skeptics. If moral judgments were norm or fiat dependent, there would be no problem about the thought that, e.g., masturbation or homosexual practices just are impermissible, since it could be the case that they just had been prohibited or just were against our social norms. But since they are not fiat or norm dependent, I mean that one cannot appeal to this. The fact that people are allowed to say it just is wrong without having to answer the question, what harm does it do? Or indeed saying anything to connect these prohibitions with human harm or good, is a very serious matter. For it seems to imply that moral judgments do not assert a value in the way that I have argued that other evaluative judgments do. I mean, an objective value. In fact, one may be tempted to think what is clearly a ridiculous thought, because there can't be, as it were, a contradiction in the language. There is this contradiction in the use of moral terms. They are applied as if they are and are not fiat or norm dependent. Well, considering the historical connection, particularly between religion and morality, this may not seem surprising, but it does not help us to determine the logical status of the expressions used as they are used now. On the whole, in general, we use moral terms in conjunction with criteria which do, it may be in slightly remote ways, connect moral prohibitions with human good or harm. Yet, people are allowed to say that certain things just are wrong without any such basis. This is the data. What are we to make of it? One suggestion, not so far considered, but which will be very familiar to you, is that moral assertions are neither fiat or norm dependent, nor, like other value judgments, in being conceptually tied to some good rendered and depending on agreement as to where this good is found. Why should not the conclusion of our discussion be that moral judgments only look like objective evaluations? Really, they express attitudes, feelings, commendations, and the like. These are, of course, the familiar things the philosophers have been trying out. Now, the difficulties of such theories are notorious and seem to me insoluble. Without going into the matter here, I'm very happy to do it in the discussion, one would say that the difficulty is to distill the thought of morality from the materials given. For how is one to characterize moral feelings, such as e.g. guilt, without the thought of something like injury? Rawls, for instance, has written on this. How can one explain moral disapproval without referring to the thought of doing wrong? What is moral commendation, this speech act, if not a certain kind of recognition, public expressed recognition, that morally speaking, someone has done well? If moral judgment is detached from the criteria for such things as injustice, cowardice, so on, justice which involves, for instance, the notion of injury or unfairness, how are we to get so much as the thought of immorality? In each case, it seems, when one traces these theories through, as if the human good or harm, these criteria of immorality, or the thought of moral good and evil itself, must be appealed to in the explanation of the moral attitude, feeling, or speech act performance. Therefore, given that we start from a range of applications of the word good, freed from any criterial connections with human good and harm, we are going to be in difficulties when we try to construct from elements of feeling and attitude, reactions, for instance, of kind of reactions of disgust, the thought of the morally good and bad. It seems, therefore, that neither the objective, I'm not here speaking, of course, in my own voice, that neither the objective nor the subjective account of moral judgment will do. The objective account seems to ignore part of the data of linguistic usage, which does include the application of morally good, morally bad, to actions which the speaker does not bring under some category of the harmful, or e.g. the unjust, and where he treats his own judgments as unassailable expressions of intuition or ultimate moral principle, in saying, it just is so. Yet the subjective theories, such as those of Stevenson and Hare, shaped to take account of just this possibility, these criterially freed examples, and rejecting the notion of definitionally linked criteria of moral good and evil, run into difficulties of their own, and seem to lose, unless they smuggle in, just the thought they're trying to explain. I now want to make a positive suggestion for the solution of the difficulty about the status of moral judgment. I accept that certain people do say of certain things, and particularly it seems where sexual morality is concerned, they just are wrong. Treating these assertions, some people make these judgments, most of them I think, as in no need of justification on any kind of ground of human good and harm. If these judgments are becoming less common as time goes on, as I suppose they are, this is neither here nor there. It is part of the data of the usage of moral language that moral expressions very commonly have been, and even now still are, used in this way. And if this is the case, it must be possible to give some account of the use of moral language, e.g. an account in characterizing it as objective or subjective, which shall take in this data. If we are in difficulties, it must be because of some mistake in what we think about what is going on. The mistake can't be in the language. And we would expect this, or we might expect this, to come from some wrong assumption which we make without even noticing that we do. This, I think, is exactly what is the case. Our wrong assumption is, I suggest, when we make it, I suggest, in supposing that the unsupported use of moral language, I mean where the speaker says it just is immoral, that in this use a man is properly to be described as making a moral judgment at all. This is a very controversial way of putting my suggestion, and as I have no great interest in the use of the expression making a moral judgment, I will put the point in what may be a less objectionable way. Thus, we are wrong in treating as equally determinant of the concept of moral good and evil all non-deviant uses of words such as immoral or morally good. On the contrary, there is, I want to suggest, a distinction that must be made between primary and secondary or dependent uses, and an analogy will perhaps show what I mean. It concerns the use of the word red. It's a fact about the word red, it's part of the linguistic data to be covered by an account of the use of this word, the judgments in which the word red is used, that it appears both in sentences in which the speaker is saying that a certain object, or anything in the external world, could be a flash of light as far as that goes, a dress, a book, and so on, is red, and also in describing images, saying, I shut my eyes and red image occurred to me. In reporting dreams, I dreamt I met so-and-so wearing a red coat. And in the expression, an impression of red, or an appearance of redness. As in, it looked red to me. Now suppose that we took all these uses together, it, the dress, the book, and so on, is red. I got a red image. I dreamt he was wearing a red coat, and gives me an impression of red. Suppose we took all these uses together, and then asked whether ascriptions of redness were or were not objective judgments. It would surely be reasonable to argue that redness is not an objective property. For is it not quite allowable for a man to treat his judgment, it was a red impression, compare a red image, as unassailable? Does he not say, it just is? And is it not true that we cannot query his sincere report and require no agreement in reaction from anyone else? So, written off the objective account, we might try to give a subjective account. We're now around about 1925, in the analogy of morality, or 30 perhaps. So we might try to give a subjective account of the meaning of red, taking the thought that something is red to be as well established by these examples, dream, impression, image reports, as by the application of red to things in the external world. But then we should find that we lost just the concept we were trying to explain. For we can understand red in a report of a dream, a description of an image, or a sentence about an impression of redness, only if we already understand red as it is used in the external world. One might put the point by saying that the thought of something's being red, actually being red, as the book or the dress are red, essentially enters into the dream, image, or impression report. We could not have the latter usages without the former. And it's in this sense that the dream, image, and impression reports are secondary, and the external world use is primary. They are needed to give us the concept, the mere thought of redness. Suppose now that this is, as I think, in some important respects, a correct model for the use of the expression morally wrong, morally good, and so on. We should then find that some uses of such terms were, though perfectly allowable linguistically, nevertheless secondary in the following sense, that they were dependent on other uses of the terms. What this would mean is that the thoughts expressed in moral judgments could not be explained without a reference to definitionally linked criteria of moral good and evil. I mean, human good and harm, ones I've been talking about. Nevertheless, there would be an established use of moral terms which is independent of these criteria, just as there are uses of the word red to which agreed reactions are quite irrelevant. If, in this case of moral language, the use is not marked out from the others by the kind of linguistic devices that show a dream report, a description of images, or a report of the redness that is merely an impression, that is neither here nor there. What marks it out is that it operates as a subjective, unassailable expression, since the speaker takes as irrelevant other people's reactions and the normal criteria for moral good and evil. That he himself is inclined to speak of his supposed judgment as if nevertheless it was objective is also neither here nor there. For what he has is at most the trappings of objectivity, in the inclination to say such things as, well, I'm right and you're mistaken. But these expressions, divorced from their usual connection with a method for showing rightness and wrongness, give no objectivity at all. Compare, you understand this point, saying, and when I was giving a dream report, I dreamt last night that I was walking such and such, and I met Professor Ryle. Oh no, wait a minute, I'm wrong. It was so-and-so. This gives no objectivity at all. It's for this reason that I'm inclined to say that our speaker, who insists that certain things just are right or wrong, breaking the definitional links with human good and harm, is not making a moral judgment. The words as he uses them should rather be explained as reporting the impression or feeling that something is morally good or bad. He, of course, does not think that this is what he is doing, but his own account of the matter is not something that we must respect. Most people are inclined to say that in talking about their sensations, they report a logically private object, We do not, therefore, suppose that Wittgenstein's account of the matter must be incorrect. Let me now return to the moral skeptic whose views we considered at the beginning of the paper. Was he right or wrong? My conclusion is that he was right for some supposed moral judgments, call them if you like moral judgments, and wrong for others. He was right in thinking of some examples of the use of words such as immoral, in which a man says it just is immoral to do such and such, as merely an expression of a subjective reaction, no doubt dictated in many cases by a lingering on of religious ordinance or social taboo, or just plain prejudice learnt at his mother's knee. But this could not be the correct account of moral judgment in general, in that it expressed a subjective reaction, since a general account that left out criterial connections with human good and harm, and kept only feelings and reactions, would be unable to capture the thought of a specifically moral good and evil. Hence, he is right to be skeptical, A, of the unsupported uses, and B, of the whole business as we are apt to see it, with the unsupported, unassailable judgments lumped in with the rest. But he is wrong to see all uses of moral language as mere expressions of subjective reaction. It is not, and if my argument is correct, it could not be so.